Hey everyone, it's time for a Shadowlands tier list, and this is going to be for the raids. I am still Solo, the guy who covers all things Blizzard. If you like the content, why don't you take a moment and hit that subscribe button, so that way you can always be informed when I drop a new video. So with that being said, let's jump into it. Alright, so this season of Shadowlands is a little bit different than usual. Normally, we would only have one raid tier to focus on, but because of the faded raids, we have 3 of them. So rather than making a tier list for every single faded raid, I'm going to be going over the data and basically consolidating them all into one just super tier list. Once again, the data I'm going to be going over is from subcreation.net. I'll be looking at the data for all 3 of the faded raids, seeing where each of the spec is on those lists, and then creating my own tier list for people that just want to say, okay, I want to raid, what should I play? Rather than, okay, I want to raid, but what's good for Castle Nathria versus what's good for Sepulture? I just wanted to condense this into just one tier list and just make it pretty simple. So let's start off with the tanks. In the S tier, we have Blood Death Knights. Now, Blood TKs are here obviously because they're just insanely OP right now. They have great raid utility, they're considered the jack of all trades for tanking, and really they just kind of have an answer to anything that the raid can throw at them. They also have really great immunity for magic, they have a combat res, and mass grip. Plus, they're just doing insane amounts of damage right now, so that always helps. In the A tier, we have Guardian Druids. Currently, Guardian Druids are doing really well considering their damage is just really awesome. And on top of that, they have some really good passive damage reductions with Iron Fur. And plus, they just have awesome raid utility with Stampeding Roar and Convoke the Spirits. In the B tier, we have Brewmaster Monks, who are not exactly insanely good or bad at anything, but they have a really awesome feature which is Stagger. Being able to just brush off a portion of damage and then, using different brews they can remove that damage entirely is just a really awesome thing, and they've always been known as like the, that progression tank because of that. And on top of that, the spec is just really easy to play, so that's kind of an added bonus. Now for the C tier, we have Protection Paladins. Prop Pallies have great group utility with their blessings and the ability to off heal, but their damage currently isn't anything compared to Blood or Guardian. And then also, when you compare them to all the other tanks, they actually have the lowest health pool, even if you factor in the Force set. And finally, for the D tier, I'm putting Protection Warrior and Vengeance Demon Hunters here together. Pot Warriors are not the highest because at the moment, the people are still kind of figuring out how to play them, especially after they just got that huge buff. I just don't think there's enough data to justify putting them any higher in the tier. And on top of that, Prot Warriors just require a lot of extra effort to perform well, so I think that's another reason why it's not as popular as the other tanks. And then finally we look at Vengeance, and they're in the D tier because their single target isn't very good, and they just have a very poor universal damage reduction outside of Fiery Brand, which requires a target, so that's kind of an issue with them. So moving on to the melee DPS, which I think is fairly balanced. For the S tier, we actually don't have anything. And then once we get to the A tier, we have the Unholy Death Knights, Outlaw Rogues, Fury Warriors, and Survival Hunters. Unholy DKs have really strong AoE burst windows. They also have a really good execute, they have low cooldowns, and they're actually pretty good at surviving a lot of mechanics. Outlaw Rogues have really good DPS, they're super mobile, and they have great defensive cooldowns. And on top of that, they're pretty easy to swap targets with. Fury Warriors are kind of similar to Outlaw Rogues, as they're just AoE machines. They have very powerful tier set, they have really good sustain, and they can swap from single target to AoE very quickly, and of course they have Rallying Cry, which is an awesome raid defensive. And with Survival is just doing insane damage because of their tier set. The spec's really easy to play, and that combined with Hunters having the largest population of players out there, it's really no surprise that Survival is just super prominent right now. So now we move on to the B tier, and here we have the Ret Paladins, Frost Death Knights, Windwalker Monks, Arms Warrior, and the Havoc Demon Hunter. Now, Red is arguably probably the strongest burst DPS spec in the game, and they have some really awesome utility, which makes them a great class or spec to have in your raid. Frost Death Knights have some of the best raid utility with Death Grip, and they have some really strong sustained single target damage. Windwalker Monks have really strong AoE, they're super mobile, and they also provide a melee DPS buff. Now, Arms are kind of interesting because their damage isn't very good, but the main reason why they are brought to raids is because their single target's pretty good, but the main focus on that is just the being able to execute things is really good to have, and on top of that, just like Fury, they have Rallying Cry. And then similar to Windwalker Monks, Havoc Demon Hunters provide the raid with a damage buff to casters, so you always want to have one in the raid, and then they have really good defensive abilities and some AoE utility as well with Darkness. Now in the C tier we have Enhancement Shamans. Now their DPS isn't the best, but they are brought to the raids because it's another class that has Bloodlust. They have Wind Fury Totem, which is really good for melee, and they also can self-res. Then finally we have the D tier, which is going to be the Feral Druids, Assassination Rogues, and Subtlety Rogues. Feral Druid DPS isn't that amazing, and the rotation is best described as just too much work for very little reward. It's basically, why play a spec that is unfun, or at least to most people, a little bit difficult, their AoE is kind of lacking, and it's just one of the cases where there's so many other melee DPS to play, and that role is super competitive, so it's like just there's way other options than a Feral, so it's why they're down here. And then Assassination Rogue is just mainly, they don't really have very good AoE, they're mainly single target, and then Subtlety Rogue has just received a lot of nerfs over the time, and they just kind of suffer because their tier set really wasn't that strong. Now moving on to the range DPS. So in the S tier, we have Demonology Warlocks. It finally appears that the nerfs to Destruction have crowned a new king, and it's the Demo Warlock. Their damage profile is just a little bit better than Destruction when it comes to the raid scene, which is why they're not considered at least, better in the raid environment. In the A tier, we have Fire Mage and Destro Warlocks. Fire has always been a spec that scales very well into the late game, and this is no exception. Fire damage is super strong, they have some really great raid buffs like Arcane Intellect and Time Warp. They're also really mobile because they have Blink, and also because of the defensive abilities like Ice Block and their Mage Shields. Destruction Warlocks have great utility as far as health stones, they do portals, and the soul stones are really good. They also are just naturally tanky, and their DPS is very strong. And next we move to the B tier, where we have Elemental Shamans, Beast Mastery Hunters, Marksmanship Hunters, Balanced Druids, and Shadow Priests. Now Elemental Shaman damage is pretty good, and they're pretty easy to play. They also have some great raid utility and a self-res, just like their melee counterpart. Beast Mastery Hunters have decent damage. They lack in defensive cooldowns, but the really good thing about them is that they can just do their entire rotation while they're moving. Marksmanship Hunter has really good burst AoE, but their single target is a bit lacking. Balanced Druids have the truly uncapped AoE in the game, and Shadow Priest just got a huge buff, plus they also have the most sought after DPS buff in the game, which is Power Infusion. And then in the C tier we have Frost Mages, because just like Fire Mages they have great raid utility and defensives, but their DPS just isn't as good as Fire. And in the D tier we have Arcane Mages and Affliction Warlocks. Now, Arcane has some really good single target damage, but the spec has just been notorious for being super complex and it's just really tedious, so not a lot of people like to play it. And then Affliction Warlocks have mediocre single target damage, and their just funnel is not very good. So that should do it for the DPS specs, and then we finally move on to the healers. Now, for the S tier, we have the Restoration Druids, and they're in the S tier because they have some of the best survivability out of all the healers. They are very mobile, they have some pretty good damage, and their healing is really great too. Plus, the HOTS that they put out is they're just super good right now, and they have some really awesome cooldowns like Trank and Flourish. In the A tier, we have the Holy Priests. Now, Holy Priests have some of the strongest heals in the game, and they also have some really awesome raid cooldowns like Symbol of Hope and Holy Ward Salvation. Plus, another nice little neat thing about them is they can actually heal while they're dead for a short period of time. And then we're going to be moving on to the B tier, where we're going to have Restoration Shaman. Now, Resto Shamans are kind of tanky. They have some of the best group AoE focused heals in the game, and they have some really strong cooldowns and raid utility. In the C tier, we have the Mistweaver Monks. Now, Mistweaver Monks have some really strong heals, and they're actually really fun to play, but their biggest downfall is the fact that their heals are just super mana intensive. They can go out of mana really quick, and that's kind of like the biggest issue they have. And it's a shame because I personally love Mistweavers. I think they're really fun to play, and I just really wish that Blizzard would kind of go back and just address what's going on with their healing, because if they didn't have the mana issues, they'd be like S tier for sure. And in the D tier, we have Holy Paladins. Now, Holy Paladins used to be insanely good, and they used to have really good damage, but they've kind of suffered from some nerfs, and their AoE healing is kind of lacking, unless they specifically have people grouped up and really close together to benefit. Otherwise, their healing for AoE is just not very good. And then finally, in the F tier, we have Discipline Priests. Now, back in the day, Disc Priests used to be insanely good. They were always like S tier, you always had to have one in your groups, but now, at least for raiding, they just kind of suffered from nerfs. Their tier pieces aren't really that good, and they just suffer because they just require so much ramping up to actually get set up for the healing that it just takes way too long, and that's kind of where they're suffering. So there you have it, guys. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you liked it, please let me know by liking and subscribing to my channel. Again, I just want to let everyone know that this tier list isn't something that's set in stone. I know for raiding specifically, like, just play what you guys enjoy. If you play a spec that you really like and you put the time in to learn that spec, chances are you're going to perform great on it. Never let anyone dictate what you can and can't play. And with that, I hope you guys have a great day, and like always, I'll see you in the next video.